First, we're going to cream together the sugar and shortening. I'm using a buttered flavor vegetable shortening here, but you could use margarine or even butter, or 50% butter and 50% shortening. Add the granulated white sugar and mix together well for at least 15 minutes by hand with a whip or on the mixer with a paddle, stopping along the way to scrape down the sides and rubbing a bit between your fingers until you can no longer feel the grit of the sugar and you just have a smooth, sweet paste. While that's mixing, you can crack your room temperature eggs, and as always, against a flat surface and into a small glass bowl first, so you can examine them for impurities, blood spots, or pieces of shell before you mix them into your dough. Scramble the eggs together and weigh out the amount you need for your recipe. Then set the rest aside for later. It will be used near the end. Then measure your orange juice and the orange zest. Be careful as you scrape the orange that you don't press too hard and scrape too deeply. The orange-colored outside of the skin contains the oils rich with flavor that we want, but the whiter inside part is the bitter-tasting pulp that we don't want. Slowly pour the scrambled egg into the creamed sugar so it doesn't splash all over. It helps to turn the mixer to the slowest speed while you're adding these ingredients. Next, add the orange juice. Then the orange zest, salt, and vanilla. Now after those ingredients are added, continue mixing at a medium speed while you prepare the flour mix. Okay, for perfection I use a 50-50 mixture of two flours. One half is American General Mills Pure as Snow, a bleached cake flour with no added leavening. This cake flour is a fine 00 grind, perfect for high-fat doughs, and with only 8% protein, it creates almost no gluten, so the dough will be very tender. The other half is unbleached bread flour, which has about 12.4% protein. Protein in the bread flour creates enough gluten to hold the dough together and keep it from crumbling, cracking, or falling apart. For the bread flour, I use pizza flour, which is also ground to a fine 00 consistency. Together, the two flours make an all-purpose flour blend with a 00 grind, but you can use all-purpose flour if you don't have cake and bread flour. You can also use 100% unbleached pastry flour, which has around a 9% protein content and gets almost the same very tender result. Mix the flour with baking powder and add it in 2 or 3 batches to your sweet wet mixture. When adding the flour, use the mixer's paddle attachment or by hand with a spatula and continue to mix the dough on the slowest speed for only about 3 to 5 minutes, just until it begins to form large clumps and sticks together if you squeeze a handful of it. It should feel almost like a pie shell dough. Then dump it out, squeeze it together, and flatten it to about an inch thick so that it cools all the way through quickly. Wrap it in plastic and put it in the refrigerator overnight. You don't even need to flour your work surface. This dough shouldn't be sticky at all. If you do flour the surface, flour it very lightly. If the dough is sticky, gently knead it on a floured surface for a few minutes, allowing it to pick up enough of the flour until it's no longer sticky, and then refrigerate it. Now is a good time to get a feel for this specially modified shortbread style dough. It should be very soft. You could leave thumbprints in it. You can bend a thick piece without it tearing right away, and it should tear, not bend. You should be able to press out a thinner section and roll it up easily. It stretches as it bends. It should be a little tacky and oily, slightly sticking to the board, but easily scraped loose. If there's too much oil, it will flatten out during baking and lose the roll shape. If there's too much orange juice, it will be very sticky to the board. You may have to add a little more flour while it's on the board, depending on your climate and the type of flour you're using. in order to get this texture. Okay, the next day before you pull your dough out of the refrigerator, soak the raisins in some water for 15 minutes to make them nice, moist, plump, and tender. Squeeze one to make sure that it's not hard inside, and then put them in a strainer so they're no longer soaking wet. Empty raspberry jam into a bowl and add the cake crumbs to it. If you don't have cake crumbs, because maybe you don't have a bakery, then add panko or non-seasoned breadcrumbs. You can even use a little flour or cornstarch as a last resort. Flour or cornstarch will make your filling a little bit pasty, but the cake or breadcrumbs will simply keep the jam from running out of the pastry during cooking. Then add the small amount of cinnamon to the raspberry mixture. Mix it all together well and set it aside for later. Get your leftover egg mixture from the earlier part of the recipe and mix it with sugar at a 1-to-1 ratio by volume. 1 spoon of sugar for each spoon of egg. I usually keep some toasted walnuts around, but if you don't, they're easy to make. Heat the oven to 325 degrees Fahrenheit or 165 Celsius. Put the walnuts onto a tray or tin foil and bake them for 10 minutes. Be very careful not to overbake the nuts. They turn from baked to burnt in less than 2 minutes, so it's better to underbake them rather than burn them. Burnt nut flavor saturates and ruins an entire dish. If they burn, throw them away. Underbaked nuts are fine, adding a subtle nutty flavor to anything. We only bake them enough to take the slight bitterness away. Once they're baked, you don't even have to wait for them to cool. Fold them up in foil or a plastic bag, and use something like a rolling pin or mallet to crush them into tiny little pieces. Weigh the amount that you need into a bowl and set it aside. Store some extra for later use on cereals and all sorts of other recipes. Now to assemble the tea biscuit. While your dough is still in the refrigerator, set up your raisins, walnuts, jelly mix, and sweet egg mix ready on the table. When you take your dough out, we first need to do what's called breaking the dough. So put it in the mixer or knead it by hand for another 3 to 4 minutes until it turns like plastic again. Then put your dough on the work surface and roll it out to a 1/4 inch thick. I use 2 1/4-inch pieces of wooden screen molding as a thickness guide, available at home improvement stores for next to nothing. Always roll from the center out and never press down hard or it will stick to the board. If you're having trouble with sticking to the roller, use some plastic film between the roller and the dough until you get more practice. Once it's rolled out into a rectangle about 6 inches wide by however long you like, you can start putting the filling on. Spread the raspberry first, then sprinkle on walnuts, and finally sprinkle the raisins on sparsely, spreading them out enough to get a raisin in every bite. Use something to press the raisins and nuts down into the dough a little so they don't fall off when you roll the dough up. A rolling pin or offset spatula works best, but you can even use the bottom of a glass or pan. Here's the trick. Roll the dough loosely into thirds, using a bench scraper to loosen the dough from the board a little at a time. Don't roll it tightly. If you roll it too tight, it'll crack when the dough rises as it bakes. Roll from the bottom up once, and then from the top, roll the dough over the bottom fold. Leave the seam at the bottom edge, but don't tuck it under the pastry or it might crack because it can't expand as it rises during baking. The roll should be about 2 to 3 inches thick and however long. Mark and cut the roll into 2 to 3 inch biscuit sections, dipping the cutting tool into flour each time to prevent it from sticking. Separate the sections and place them with about 1 inch of space between them onto a silicone baking pad or a cookie sheet lined with parchment paper or greased. Brush each biscuit with the sweet scrambled egg and sprinkle a little coarse sugar or walnut on top. Bake them for 20 to 25 minutes until the edges just start to turn a golden brown. Don't brown them. When they're done baking, take them out and let them cool on the baking pan. When hot, they're quite soft and will fall apart, so they need to sit and cool like cookies. At room temperature, they become more crunchy and hold together.